The danger arising from war in the Mideast may not be as distant as we'd like to think.
Do you think it's possible that there could be groups, small groups of terrorists or even individuals who are waiting and making a plan here in the United States?
Absolutely, unfortunately. We now have a large enough sets of communities of radicalized people in the United States that this could be a combination of international inflows of people teaming up with people who are already here.
This week, we look at the most likely threats to Americans and what the government can do to stop them.
The Republican presidential debate.
The most recent Republican debate happened without the leading candidate, Donald Trump.
He owes it to you to be on this stage.
You know, everybody wants to talk about President Trump.
The debate also didn't include some of the other candidates.
We're the party of equal opportunity, of individual responsibility, of a limited role of government.
The federal government not only gets in the way of people's lives, but what it does in terms of raising the cost of everything, but doesn't add any value.
They call me unserious because they know how serious I am.
This week, we give voice to some of the candidates in the race, but not in the spotlight.
And on this Veterans Day weekend, we take a look at America's oldest military honor.
Washington picked the color purple. He wanted somebody who would stand out and separate that soldier from the rest of the soldiers.
This week, the meaning and value of the Purple Heart.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. We begin with the threat to the home front. While the U.S. is providing billions of dollars worth of emergency military and humanitarian aid to Israel and Ukraine amid their wars, there's heightened concern at home. The FBI, Homeland Security, and the National Counterterrorism Center recently issued an advisory to state and local law enforcement. It said that lone offenders inspired by or reacting to the ongoing war between Israel and the Islamic extremist terrorist group Hamas pose the most likely threat to Americans. Factor in the porous southern border, and some analysts say it's a recipe for disaster. Today, we ask one expert what can be done. Ken Cuccinelli was Deputy Homeland Security Chief under President Trump and a former senior official at the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. When news of the attack on Israel came, what do you suspect the smart people inside our government immediately did or started to talk about to make sure that they were working as hard as they could to protect us?
Well, they probably started shuffling back through the terror watch list folks who have come in. And I suspect that some of the ones they've let in, they may be more inclined now to go run back down and remove. And it takes an awful lot for this administration to decide to remove somebody.
There are disturbing numbers on that score for fiscal year 2023. Customs and Border Protection recorded more than 2.4 million encounters with illegal border crossers at America's southwest border. That includes 169 people on the U.S. terrorist watch list, 18 in September alone. Officials also arrested 35,000 aliens with criminal convictions or outstanding warrants, including nearly 600 known gang members, 178 from the notorious MS-13 criminal gang. Cuccinelli says the state of America's border today is a far cry from national sentiment after the Islamic extremist terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001.
First of all, a lot of the folks who perpetrated 9/11 were in the country illegally. They'd overstayed visas. They'd come a variety of ways, but they were here illegally. On a bipartisan basis, it was decided that we should have a secure border, otherwise terrorists could come across it.
But it's hard to understand how we could have so much resolve 20 years ago and have it slip into people thinking we should be nice. Like, how did we get from there to here? Just short memories?
Short memories, yes, and perceived short-term political advantage.
So with that backdrop, when you heard about what had happened with the attack on Israel, professionally, what were some of your initial thoughts?
Well, first of all, I was we focus on America, but I was surprised at how much Israel was caught by surprise.
What were your thoughts about what we ought to be doing and could be doing to protect ourselves now?
Well, of course, we could close our borders, and by that I simply mean secure it, or at least try. When you send the message that you're definitely not going to secure the border, you invite much worse people over the border because they have a risk calculus in trying to come in here. The what can I accomplish if I get there, that's from their perspective, their reward. And what is their risk? The risk of being discovered along the way or being caught or stopped. Well, when you tell them you have an open border, you've lowered the risk portion of their calculus. These are evil people, but we can't assume they're stupid. And so they assess these things. And if you ask the DHS today about the rise in the number of people on the terror watch list coming across, they'll say, well, it's really just a function of the overall numbers. As if that's okay. Well, that's a function of the open borders. And literally, we have hundreds of thousands of folks from the Middle East and the dangerous part of Africa, by that I mean from a terrorist standpoint, coming into the United States that didn't used to.
We've been hearing about this for at least the past couple of years, and yet, as far as I know, there has not been a big terrorist attack by extremists who have crossed the southern border into the United States illegally or legally. What do you make of that it hasn't happened?
Well, we do know a few things that have been interceded with. For example, the attempt to kill former President Bush, where those folks were coming across the southern border. Thankfully, we picked up on that. So there have been some successes in that regard. The problem in having these discussions is the more talented, successful terrorists aren't even seen. They're not in the gotaways number. The gotaways number are people who were spotted but not caught. They're in the number of we don't know what the number is. And those are the most dangerous of all. We have no basis to identify or pursue those folks until some piece of evidence crops up that gets spotted and flagged. And that's awfully hard to do once you're in the country.
Do you think it's possible that there could be groups, small groups of terrorists or even individuals who are waiting and making a plan here in the United States?
Absolutely, unfortunately.
What's a sleeper cell?
A sleeper cell is a small group of people that come in typically with a mission beforehand or a goal, and they don't communicate with anybody else. The smaller version of that is the hardest to track of all is the lone operator. And that's true whether they're international terrorists, domestic terrorists, what have you. And we now have a large enough sets of communities of radicalized people in the United States that this could be a combination of international inflows of people teaming up with people who are already here.
How concerned do you find yourself that something like that could happen? Either there are sleeper cells waiting to activate or even lone terrorists just waiting for an opportunity.
Oh, I worry a great deal about that. I honestly, as a statistical matter, I think they're here.
If you are part of this calculus, just dealing the hand that you've been dealt, what sorts of things would you be initiating right now?
You mean if I were in the administration? Mm-hmm. I'd be asking to put the military on the border in between legal ports of entry to truly close it.
If you just had to give some takeaway thoughts on the whole big picture now that we're looking at our threat here at home and protecting ourselves, what are some things you would say or a message you would deliver?
The weaponization of law enforcement and intelligence in this country for political purposes has been pretty severe. It's 10 years old or so, at least, and it's pretty ingrained in the deep state. They're trying to generate narratives instead of identify threats. And we're already a bankrupt country. We're so deep in the hole, I don't know that we can ever get out of it from a funding and debt standpoint. But we should be treating these as rare resources that need to be deployed on the highest valued use basis, which is also, by the way, why I would put military members in between the legal ports of entry. Just cut off the flow and then turn your intelligence sources and resources toward drilling down on our most severe threats, rather than having to parse through millions of people a year coming across the border after they've come in to see what you let walk by you in terms of threats to the United States, in terms of its existence, and to the safety of the people who live here.
National security agencies have advised that foreign terrorist organizations have called for attacks in the U.S., and that could lead to homegrown extremists to attack Jewish or U.S. government targets. When we return, 3 presidential hopefuls you probably haven't heard much about. You probably haven't heard of all of them, but at least 13 people that we know of are running for president. Considering that Trump and Biden were once at the bottom of their respective parties' polls, we continue speaking with 2024 candidates. Today, some lesser-known presidential hopefuls, and a few things you may not know about them, even if you've heard their names.
Today, we're meeting the software guy, the true conservative, and the speaker. The 2 Republicans see the border crisis as a top domestic concern and China as a looming foreign threat. But there are key distinctions between them. You might think of Doug Bergham as the software guy. He's governor of North Dakota, started a company called Great Plains Software. It was acquired by Microsoft for $1.1 billion in 2001.
I've had a front row seat as an entrepreneur running global businesses and also as governor to see how much the federal government not only gets in the way of people's lives in terms of infringing on personal freedoms, but what it does in terms of raising the cost of everything, but doesn't add any value, particularly when you've got ideological programs like we see around the economy and energy and national security that the Biden administration is pushing.
Bergham insists it's fully possible for him to lodge a come-from-behind effort to win the Republican nomination.
2016, open seat for governor, jumped in as the outsider, down 60 points in the poll, and everybody said we couldn't win, the same way they said you can't build a global tech company in Fargo. And we ended up winning that fall by over 40 points in the governor's race, won the primary by 20 points, and then got reelected in 2020 by over 40 points. Those are in 2016 and 2020, largest margins of any gubernatorial wins in the country.
The United States, not only best country in the world, but the strongest.
A key platform, Bergham has a plan to break up the federal bureaucracy through attrition and modernization.
Because I think if you ask the average voter, they would say, despite all the will in the world, no president is going to be able to break up the federal bureaucracy when surrounded by the federal bureaucracy.
Well, I think there's this pretty simple way right now, and demographics is our aid, because we've got so many baby boomers that are in their last 5 to 10 years of working in government, and as they retire, they do not need to be replaced if we've gone and taken whatever the paper process they were doing and digitized it. If we can take 5 to 10% out of any organization just through attrition pretty quickly, particularly where we're at in terms of the rural retirements, and then not hire them with a 22-year-old that we put on a pension, and then that 22-year-old is going to live to be 100 years old because of all the advances in medicine, and will further go broke in terms of how we are, raising our federal costs.
Asa Hutchinson brands himself as the true conservative in the GOP race. He was the youngest U.S. attorney appointed by Reagan, a member of Congress, head of the Drug Enforcement Administration, and a top border security official under George W. Bush, and was governor of Arkansas.
So I feel like there's a divide not only in America between Democrat and Republican, but in the feelings about what the Republican Party should be about, who they support, and how effective the party has been in the past 10 years or so. What's your view on the, establishment Republican Party?
You've got Donald Trump, you've got Vivek Ramaswamy, and you've got Ron DeSantis and even Nikki Haley that do not want to reflect the traditional values of the Republican Party. And they've said they don't want to go back to a pre-Trump party.
And again, name a couple of the traditional values you're talking about when they say, or they're talking about.
Well, it's the principles of Abraham Lincoln and Ronald Reagan, in which we're the party of equal opportunity, of individual responsibility, of a limited role of government, and a strong America.
Wouldn't they say they're for all of those things, though, if we ask them?
They will vary, they may, but they are very clear that it's not the Republican Party, it's the Trump Party. And so this election is about the heart and soul of not just our country, but the Republican Party. And you've got a narrower group of isolationists, which is Donald Trump, Ramaswamy, and you've got DeSantis. All want to limit the role and leadership of the United States of America. And traditional Republican views is not to limit the leadership of the United States of America, but to uphold it based upon our national character. And yet you've got leaders of our party that want to pull us back, and when you pull us back, that means that we're going to be more isolated from those markets across the globe. And that's the wrong direction for our party and America.
On the Democrat side is Marianne Williamson, who began 40 years ago giving speeches on spiritual psychotherapy before becoming an AIDS activist.
If you look at what people have said or written about you and your positions in the context of running for president, what is the impression they're giving, and how would you like to either correct that or confirm that it's true?
They make me out to be a joke. There's a term, contempt prior to investigation. People who have never even read my books opine about them. People who have never attended any of my seminars or lectures go on and on about them. Crystal Lady. Crystal is not mentioned in any of my books, any of my lectures. Wacky, kooky. And I think it's interesting, the reason why the establishment corporatist forces in the Democratic Party call me unserious. They call me unserious because they know how serious I am.
Let's say you get elected president. Your first day in office, what are some of your executive orders or priorities?
I want to cancel the Willow Project. I want to cancel any contracts where union-busting companies are having contracts with the U.S. government. I want to deschedule marijuana from a Schedule I drug. I want to order, yet again, another audit of the Pentagon. I want to start working on a conclave of the best minds that we have in the United States on early childhood, because I want to establish a United States Department of Children and Youth, and I want to hear from those who know the most, and I want to also start plans for a United States Department of Peace.
What is, I'm sorry, the first thing you said, Willow Project?
Yes.
What is that?
The Willow Project is an $8 billion oil extraction project, ConocoPhillips, in the North Slopes of Alaska. I will declare a climate emergency. We must begin immediately a just transition from a dirty economy to a clean economy. This is not the time to be ramping up fossil fuel extraction. It's time to be ramping it down.
Like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who left the Democrat Party to run as an independent, Williamson says Democrats are, quote, rigging the election so that voters have only one candidate to vote for, President Biden. Coming up, seeking Purple Heart recipients. We just observed Veterans Day, thanking all those who served our country, many of them Purple Heart recipients. Now there's an unprecedented effort to track down the names of all those who've received the honor. Lisa Fletcher reports.
From the battlefields of 2 world wars to conflicts in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and beyond, America's heroes are remembered and honored. And while there are different medals for bravery, service, and skill, there's one decoration that stands apart, reserved for sacrifice, either in body or life. The Purple Heart is our most awarded medal. More than 1.8 million have been given. And a few hours north of New York, there's a place dedicated to those who've received it.
And from our database, the first World War I recipient as well.
Peter Bedrosian is the program director.
What is the National Purple Heart Hall of Honor?
Well, it's the first museum dedicated to collecting, preserving, and sharing the stories of Purple Heart recipients. Only one in the nation.
The Purple Heart traces its origin to George Washington, who in 1782 created the Badge of Military Merit for soldiers of the Continental Army. After the Revolutionary War, the award was forgotten for a long time. But in 1932, Army General Douglas MacArthur revived and renamed it the Purple Heart. In the midst of World War II, it became a decoration for all members of the armed forces wounded or killed in action.
Why is it a Purple Heart?
It's a Purple Heart. Washington picked the color purple. Purple is the color of royalty. He wanted something that would stand out and separate that soldier from the rest of the soldiers.
Perhaps because of just how many have been issued, there's no central list of all those who've received the medal. That's one thing Bedrosian and his team are trying to fix.
There is no comprehensive list. The reason for that is the information is found in the records of the recipient. The data were never shared to create award lists. The only medal in American military awards that has that distinction is the Medal of Honor.
Those who've received the Purple Heart are encouraged to enroll their names and their stories here for preservation.
Why is it important to track down the Purple Heart recipients?
Because no one knows who they are. It's not a figure that's out there. It's not you see Medal of Honor recipients and award ceremonies. This is one you're not aware of. It's invisible to many, many people. And those sacrifices that are made are done by people who didn't intend to do that on a given day. They're people who served this country. They took that oath, understanding it might be costly to them. And I think we need to say thank you.
And beyond saying thank you, they're trying to keep the names and stories of all those who sacrificed in combat pulsing through America's memory. For Full Measure, I'm Lisa Fletcher in New Windsor, New York.
After a break, what's ahead next week on Full Measure? Coming up next week on Full Measure, it's America's closest adversary in terms of proximity, the communist island of Cuba. Now concerns that Cuba is potentially forging dangerous ties with more powerful adversaries. In the news in the United States, there is a lot about China and concerns and allegations that China has already been operating some sort of base or surveillance operation out of Cuba and plans to have some sort of larger operation out of Cuba. Is that true?
No evidence has been put in place.
I mean, no evidence, but is it true? We take an eye-opening trip to off-limits Cuba on the next Full Measure. Until then, we'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable. Thanks for watching. I'm Sharyl Attkisson.